First, a few words about myself. I work for UN Refugee Agency, or the very, very short way to say it is UNHCR, as you maybe sometimes hear in media. And of course, there are many different UN agencies and different names, and sometimes it's confusing. So our mandate is to ensure protection of people who are, as we say, displaced globally, in any country, any region, it doesn't matter, including, of course, also the Baltic states. And I work specifically at a regional office, which is located in Stockholm. And we cover 8 countries of a region what is called Northern Europe. So these are 5 Nordic countries and 3 Baltic countries. I am myself from Latvia originally, and I work within UNHCR with media. So I answer media requests, I help journalists to find information about refugees. And we try also to organize journalist trainings and things like that. And we also try to reach out to the general public and try to explain what a refugee is and what we are trying to do to help them. And I'm also a spokesperson for Estonia and Latvia. So that is very, very shortly about myself. So about this common information space, of course, I mean, my specialty is refugees. So I will try to talk about some interesting moments that appear when we talk about how to include this particular group in the common information space. Because, of course, as any group or any individual, if you live in a given society, given country, you deserve also to be included in the common information space. I think that's a no-brainer, and it applies also to refugees. Now, first, a little bit about the context, because, and I will speak specifically about Estonia and Latvia, because that is my work field, so to say. Because the context here is a little bit specific and very, very different also from other countries in the region. First of all, the numbers of refugees are tiny. According to our own statistics, in roughly 20 years, that's the time since both countries ratified Refugee Convention and it was possible to apply for asylum. So in Estonia, 411 people granted refugee status. 411 in 20 years. In Latvia, slightly more, 662. Also, we can agree it's a tiny number. So this makes, of course, this group of people vulnerable in itself. I mean, if you take just a very small group and then you try to depict them in media and so on, they feel maybe even threatened and so on. And also, sometimes they just don't want to talk to media. They feel they belong to a very small community. So also, both countries have very short experience of refugee reception and also integration. 20 years, it's nothing. If you compare to countries like Sweden, who have been accepting refugees for years and years since Second World War from different countries, they have experienced a number of challenges that Estonia and Latvia are just starting to experience. So this is also an interesting context that we need to take into account. Then, of course, media. What I didn't say in the beginning, I'm also a former journalist, so I have been working for radio, print, web, also in different languages, also English, Swedish. But the interest of media, and also specifically if you talk about coverage from abroad, from different countries, which of course were much more affected by refugees arriving, for example, Greece or Italy, for a number of reasons. Among them, of course, also the resources, mainly financial resources. You have to pay for a journalist trip to far away. That coverage was very, very limited. And I'm not even talking about faraway places like Lebanon or Syria or Turkey. Of course, 2015 was a little bit a game changer, because then we understood with the European so-called refugee crisis. I say so-called because also in the Baltic countries, the numbers are still very small. So one migration scholar in a conference in Riga a couple of years ago said the following, that we in the Baltics have managed to create a refugee crisis without refugees. So of course the interest of media has been on the rise, and also we as organization, we have helped a number of refugees to go and report from abroad. So it has become better, but still there is a difference from other, for example, European countries. Then of course, since also because of these tiny numbers, most of the locals have never seen a refugee. And I think it's gonna stay like that for quite some time. And of course, it's a little bit of a dilemma. Nobody wants the country to experience a huge influx, but then if you have just 400 persons and some of them are most probably not in the country anymore, so many people will not have direct contact with refugees, so everything that they think is from the television, internet, and most often not even from Estonian or Latvian context. But then the last thing that I think it's a little bit peculiar one, because both Estonians and Latvians have been refugees themselves, and quite on a big scale. Just to mention one example, about 40,000 from Estonia and Latvia went to Sweden by the end of the Second World War, using boats. I guess it resembles something that happens in the Mediterranean now. And also just to remember, not all of them, those who tried, did succeed. And also not all of them, and not always were maybe that well received. There were also some voices against them. In maybe more leftist Swedish press, there were even some mentions of possible influx of fascist collaborators. This, I think, also reminds of something, oh, these are Syrians, maybe there are some ISIS fighters, you know how it goes. So it's kind of similar, but I think not many make this connection. And of course we have to understand there are also differences, because at that time there was no refugee convention. And of course all of these people were arriving in Sweden and elsewhere without any valid paperwork. So it's I think important to remember that as well. So that is the context in which we operate and try to include these refugees in the common information space, and try to show them also that these people exist, and they have their stories, they are also human beings, etc., etc. Now this creates not only because of the specific local context. This applies also globally, because we as organization, UNHCR, we also say very often, and it's true, I'm not trying to challenge it in any way, that refugees, they are just like us. They're ordinary people, but they happen to be in extraordinary situation, right? The war is at your doorstep. What do? You pack your bag if you can manage, and you just leave. You leave your friends, you leave your family, you leave your country. You often take a very dangerous journey, and so on. So you're ordinary human being. You had a job, you maybe were a student, you were a mother, a father, and then everything changed. But then again, refugees are also a vulnerable group. It's a little bit of a contradiction, right? Because many of them, why do they flee? Because they are persecuted maybe because of their ethnicity, because of their religion, because of their sexual orientation. So they are also, from the very beginning, they belong to a minority. And then they end up in a completely different country. And of course, they are vulnerable as a group, by definition. Then, of course, their voices need to be heard. Just as I think it's also a no-brainer. Of course, we can go into the details, but media in general should be a little bit like a mirror of the society, right? If there are refugees, they should be also, to some extent, in media, and they deserve to tell their own stories. But then again, refugees are under what we call, and I think not many understand what it really means practically, under international protection. International because no single country can provide full protection to refugees. Countries have to cooperate. And that is also what the Refugee Convention says. But what it means practically, just to give you some examples, when the person applies for asylum, so that's the moment when you enter another state's territory and you say, hey, here am I, I'm being persecuted, there is a war, there is this and that, I want to be protected. And at that moment, your status is asylum seeker. The country that is reviewing your application has an obligation to protect information on you. Your country of origin is not supposed to know that you applied for asylum. Why? Not because we automatically assume that country is bad. No, because of different reasons, patriotism, whatever. A given country might not like that, oh, this person is in another country and he's complaining about us. Even if it's not true, even if a person is then rejected, he or she might experience trouble if the information is leaked and they are sent back or go back to their country of origin. So here you see how it all becomes a little bit problematic. Refugees' voices need to be heard, but then again, you need to sometimes protect them. And also, if you already have refugee status, you maybe have family, you have friends in your country of origin. So maybe you don't want to tell that you are in Estonia and being a refugee, because maybe a member of your family will get killed just because of that. So also, and when I said that the country has to also work to protect these individuals, it's not only the government. Everybody should understand and should try to figure out what do we do in this particular case. So it's a little bit tricky, all of it. That's why I would like to call this whole idea of let's include them, but let's be careful. It's a kind of dilemma, right? So what to do? I just try to think about it, and here is my few reflection points. The first one is of course, refugees can be described as a group, right? But each of them have their own story. Each of them is an individual. Right now, we have 68.5 million displaced people in the world. You can understand that you cannot treat them as in the same way, right? So that is one thing. Let's try to still treat them as individuals. The next one is and here I'm trying to be very careful. I'm not trying to criticize media, but everybody makes mistakes, and so do journalists as well. Media can harm refugees even without having the intent. They just don't know. They don't know situation in their home country, for example. They publish something, they publish it in a context that doesn't really work out. So, good intent, they want to, let's show this refugee, he's so nice, and it ends up badly. Then, being a refugee, it's not your main identity, it's not your core of your being. All refugees have a profession, education, they have their own religion, they have their own ethnicity, etc., etc. So being a refugee, hopefully, it's just a parenthesis, And here I want to mention an example from my own life. I studied many years in Sweden, and in a student dorm, a guy moved in, and he was from Bosnia. And we became very good friends and are still. And he was such a funny and a very bright guy. And he studied at Stockholm School of Economics. And he has been so successful in his life. This year, there were elections in Sweden. He was on the ballot, and I was just so happy to see all his posts on Facebook, and he was having a very vibrant campaign. But even he had told me the whole story, how they fled with the family. He was a teenager at the time. First they lived, because there were so many refugees arriving from former Yugoslavia at that point in Sweden, they had to put up tents. So they even spent some time in tents. And so on and so forth. But I never really thought of him as about a refugee. For me, he was a fellow student, a funny guy, friend. Refugee, that was the last thing on the list. So this is important to understand. And also many refugees, when they talk to us, but also when they talk to media, they don't want to talk to, I'm a refugee. They want to say, I was a doctor in Syria, and I was doing this and that, and I was having a fantastic career, and I have this and that hobby, and I like to play guitar, or whatever. They want to tell many different things. So let's not forget about that. The refugee, hopefully, just a parenthesis. And then language, of course, it's a hard one because it collides a little bit with the freedom of press and freedom of speech. Of course, everybody is entitled to have opinions and express them. But when people talk about illegal migrants, or I have even seen people using in media expressions like illegal asylum seeker or illegal refugee, I can't take it, because no human being is illegal. And when trying to explain this also to journalists, that yes, you can actually cross the border without a visa and apply for asylum, that's fully okay. And that such person should not even be punished. And I always say, are there illegal journalists, illegal lawyers, illegal policemen, illegal doctors? We don't say that. Even if a doctor is practicing without a license, we don't say illegal doctor. We would try to describe it, but somehow with the migrants and refugees, we say they are illegal. No human being is illegal, full stop. And such language, actually, it simply stigmatizes them. Yeah? So if we want to include them, this is just the opposite. And the last one, it happens so often. There is a huge article about refugees, and there is not a single refugee talking. And actually also this latest discussion, mainly of course it is about a global compact on migration. But people of course are mixing up. There are two global compacts at the moment to be adopted, one on migration, one on refugees. It's two different documents. First of all, mixed together of course, but as much as I have seen in Estonian media, I have never seen a single migrant or refugee voicing what they think about these compacts. So I think for me, it's a natural thing to ask a refugee or a migrant, what do you think about this? But everybody else is talking, politicians, journalists, opinion makers, not a refugee. But of course, not only with this particular topic, but also many other times. Often articles about refugee integration. You have the whole article. People working with refugees are talking, but refugees, empty. So finally, a little bit about what does this protection mean practically, and how to put it into media and common information space context. I think you recognize who is in the photo. It's one of the Pussy Riot members. It was just the other week, she was on Swedish television in a program about literature, because her book has just come out. And in the very beginning, and I was like, that's interesting. What is she talking about? Because she said, I almost didn't make it to Sweden because she's at the moment forbidden to exit. And the journalist asked, but how did you come here? And she said, I arrived on a pink pony. I always use a pink pony to travel. And that was it. And this, of course, she's not a refugee, but there is another Pussy Riot member in Sweden at the moment as asylum seeker, so it's not completely disconnected. So many refugees also don't want to reveal all the details, how they traveled, where they stopped, and so on, often for simply security reasons, and this needs to be understood. So in the context of protection, we have to understand that each refugee owns their own story, right? I mean, my profession is talk to media, right? I have to answer all the emails, I have to always pick up the phone and so on. Private individuals, also refugees, they don't have this obligation. If they don't want to talk to media, or if they say, I will tell you the story, but this is how it goes, this is how I want to tell it, they have the right to do that. I'll try to wrap up. Talking about the context, refugees and also other people who arrive in the country, they don't know the context. So we really have to try to explain to them how this will be publicized. Maybe they don't want to be on the front page of the newspaper, but they would agree to be somewhere else and so on. Is it an interview? Is it an article where we'll just take one quote from you? It's important, because otherwise it becomes problematic. So being anonymous also, I mean, often they just have to. They have family in the home country, they cannot show their face. And it's all possible, technically. I have seen such wonderful TV reports where person is shown as a human being, but they film from such an angle you will never figure out who that person is. So it's all possible, and if it's needed, we have to do it. And also for journalists, I remember in 2015 when the whole thing just exploded, I got a lot of questions from journalists. Also, of course, what is a refugee, what is asylum seeker, what is the difference, what is refugee convention, how does it work, but also about the countries of origin. And this is something that you can just read about and just try to educate yourself. What is happening in Eritrea? Why people flee from there? Oh, there is no war, yes, but it's like a very totalitarian state, right? So we have to understand where they come from. That always gives a better understanding of these people also as individuals. So, and finally, maybe there are some alternative ways how to tell their stories and include them. One thing is what we do. We try to present personal stories on our internet site. This picture that you see, that is a girl, her name is Naimo. She's now living in Iceland, but she's from Somalia. And she's what is called influencer. She's a lot on YouTube and so on. She's 20 years old. She fled from Somalia because she was, they tried to put her into a forced marriage. She was just 11 years old. So she escaped, and she's such a brilliant personality. She deserves to be out and show, you know, what she thinks and what she wants to achieve. Another one, Living Libraries. It's a project, I think, in a number of countries. I have seen it in Latvia, where refugees are invited and locals are invited. It's a quasi-closed environment. It's a safe environment where people can talk openly, and it's not published on the front page of the newspaper later. So people can come and see refugees and hear their stories. And there can be many examples, but children books. This one is actually made by Ilon Wikland, who is from Estonia, but she arrived in Sweden as a child, as a refugee during Second World War. And this is actually, it doesn't really say it, but it's a story about her. And a 5-year-old can understand this. It's a lot of pictures and very little text. But it's also, I think, for adults, it's a very emotional story, how she ended up in Sweden and also succeeded later. And many different ways, but also important to ask refugees themselves. What do you think? How can we give you your voice? How can we make you participate? It's important always to ask that. So that was all I wanted to say. Thank you.